All right, thanks everybody. So, like I said, this work actually was done last year at GeekPwn as well. And this year we're bringing a brand new attack, which is completely different, but the effect of the attack is somewhat similar. I would basically jump into this, and if you're interested in some of the details, there will be a video demo in the end, because I couldn't afford to do a live demo here because we have another demo today. So, all right, so let's get into this. Now, last year, as I said, we discovered a pretty interesting attack. I would say it's probably one of the most powerful attacks that I've ever discovered. What it allows us to do is that, given any two arbitrary hosts on the internet, as long as you tell me their IP addresses, I will be able to tell you if they're communicating using a TCP connection or not. And if they're communicating, we can then further infer the sequence number and ACK number used in the connection. So what this means is essentially I can essentially monitor which websites you're visiting, which by itself is already a privacy problem, right? Let's say if I know what IP address your device has, and I can basically check a whole bunch of websites and see if you're visiting them at any moment in time. Now, obviously with the knowledge of sequence number and ACK number, we're also able to hijack the connection completely. Or if the connection is encrypted, then we can at least reset the connection. Now, here's the outline. Because this is an academic kind of talk, so I basically borrowed the slides without any modification. So we'll get to see the background, why there's a vulnerability, how we exploited it, and how you might fix it. Now, first of all, we want to see what is the threat model. Like I said, given any two arbitrary hosts on the internet, our attack would just work, right? But you might wonder, okay, is the attacker made in the middle? Is the attacker somehow able to eavesdrop any of these traffic? Well, the answer is no. The attacker is completely off-path and blind. So the only assumption that we have is that the attacker can spoof the IP address of the client or the server to be able to send packets to either the client and server. Right? So that's basically a very low requirement on the attack. Basically means that the attacker can almost be anywhere in the world, but can still figure out if any of the two hosts on the internet are communicating or not, and hijack the connection. So, a little bit of background on TCP. I know some of you may not, well, I guess all of you probably know TCP, but the thing is, TCP has been evolving over time, and there's some interesting details that you might not know. So, actually in the past, TCP used to be very vulnerable to off-path attacks, like the threat model that we just saw, right? Why is that? Well, the attacker can basically guess the sequence number and port number, and basically by brute forcing, it has a very high success rate to be able to guess the correct sequence number that is within the acceptable receive window, and therefore terminate the connection forcefully. And basically in 2010, there's this new RFC, the new TCP standard that's proposed to mitigate this problem. The idea is to make it more difficult, or make the attacker's job more difficult, to be able to craft acceptable packets. Right? So basically, it asks the TCP receiver to do more checking. Unfortunately, this very feature, when it's implemented in Linux, introduced a new vulnerability, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now, some more background. It used to be the case that when a receiver sees a TCP SYM packet, what it'll do is, before this new RFC, before this new standard, what happens is if the SYM packet has a sequence number or actually, if the SIM packet hits an ongoing connection, but the sequence number is outside of the acceptable receive window of the current connection, then the packet is just dropped and an ACK packet will be sent back. And when the sequence number is in window, the receiver would actually reset the connection. So you see there's a problem, right? As long as you send a whole bunch of spoofed TCP SIM packets with different sequence numbers, and then as soon as the sequence number hits the receive window, then the connection has to be forcefully closed. Right? It's actually considered a vulnerability. So what this new RFC is trying to do is to make it more strict. So what happens is, regardless of the sequence number of the SIM packet, it introduces this notion of challenge jack. What this challenge jack is doing is, the receiver will say, okay, I already have a connection with you, and yet you're sending a SIM packet to me with the same 4 tuple, same port number. What are you trying to do? Are you really trying to establish a connection? This is basically a mechanism for the receiver to double check if the packet is really intended. Right? So as you see, if an attacker still wants to do the same attack, it won't be able to succeed, because there's no circumstance where the receiver would just close the connection. Right? Now let's look at this reset packet. When the receiver sees a TCP reset packet, what happens is very similar to the previous case. By the way, this sequence number space is 2 to the 32 bit. 2 to the 32, so it has 32 bit, right? So it's a huge space, but still, the receive window could be big, right? So what happens is, before this new RFC, the same thing happens, right? If the sequence number of the reset packet is out of window, then the packet is dropped. Otherwise, it resets the connection. So it's still pretty bad. Now, with the new RFC, what happens is, if the sequence number of the reset is in window, but it doesn't exactly hit the expected sequence number, which is a receive next, then the receiver should send yet another challenge jack. Now, again, this challenge jack is to double check, okay, sender, are you really trying to reset my connection? If so, you should be sending the correct sequence number, right? Now, the only time a receiver would reset the connection based on sequence number is that the sequence number exactly matches the received next. Right? It has to match 1 out of the 2 to the 32 numbers, right? Which makes the attack basically impractical for any real attacks. Now, what about data packets? Once we know the sequence number, you may want to inject the data into the connection. But in order to successfully do that, you also have to craft a packet with the correct ACK number. So what do we mean by correct ACK number? Well, it used to be the case that before this new RFC, basically half of the ACK number space is considered acceptable, which means the attacker really just has to send 2 data packets, and one of them would be guaranteed to have the correct ACK number. Now, after this new RFC, what happens is they've substantially reduced the acceptable window. And they've also introduced the challenge window. What this challenge window means is that if your ACK number belongs to this window, then again, the receiver is supposed to send a challenge jacket to double check. Okay, are you really trying to send me data packet? If so, you have to send the correct ACK number, right, to double check. Now, again, this makes the attack make the off-pass blind attack just more difficult. So now, based on all of these background knowledge, we can see that the RFC, right, the new TCP standard, is trying to do something good. Right? It's trying to make TCP more secure. Now, unfortunately, like we said, this actually introduces a vulnerability. So why? Basically, the problem is this. the RFC also introduced something called rate limit. And the idea is that because challenge jack is basically kind of a waste of resources, you're sending some double checking packets, right? They're not really serving any real purposes besides security. So what they're trying to do is to limit the number of challenge jack packets that can be sent out by a receiver at any moment, at any interval. And interestingly, Linux followed the standard faithfully, and therefore become vulnerable. So now you might wonder, why is it vulnerable still? Well, because this rate limit is actually implemented as a global rate limit, which is shared by the attacker's connection as well as the victim's connection. So anytime when you have shared resources between the attacker and the victim, there is a likelihood of side channel attacks. And this is precisely what the problem is. Now, the other thing worth mentioning is these SYN, reset, and data packets. The way they trigger challenge acts, they're almost arranged perfectly to allow our attack. So as you see, for the SYN packet, in order to be able to trigger challenge act, we don't need to guess anything. As long as we guess the correct four tuple, we would be able to trigger challenge act. And then after that, reset packet assumes that you know the correct four tuple, and the only thing we need to know is the correct in-window sequence number. Right? So this may allow us to guess the sequence number. And afterwards, the data packet may allow us to guess the ACK number. Because why? Because it triggers the challenge ACK only when the ACK number is in the challenge window. And it assumes that the four tuple and sequence number are already correct. So we can basically do this attack iteratively and eventually be able to figure out all three different things that we want to infer, which is the port on the client, the sequence number, and ACK number. Now, let's look at the vulnerability. If you followed me so far about all of the background knowledge, you should be able to understand this. So Linux implemented this global rate limit, basically in the kernel, and it has a default value of 100. This means that every 1 second, the Linux machine is allowed to send up to 100 challenge acts, right, at most. And this means the attacker and the victim, they share the same global rate limit, right? So if the attacker is able to establish a connection and somehow causes the limit to drop or to drain the limit, and then it would affect the client, right? It would affect the connection of the client, and vice versa. Right? So let's say if the attacker sends 100 reset packets, it'll be able to see 100 challenge acts back, right? Normally. But the issue is the attacker can also send spoof packet, right? Remember, in this attack, the only thing we require is the ability for the attacker to spoof the source IP address of the packets. So in this case, if the attacker sends, let's say, one single SIM packet, spoofing the client's IP address, right, and send it to the server, what happens? Well, if this SIM packet has the correct four tuple, right, has the correct guess of the client port, the server would send back a challenge ACK according to the new RFC that we just mentioned. Now, after that, the attacker can send, again, this 100 reset packets, but the response should be only 99, right? Because after all, the server has just sent one challenge ACK within the same 1 second window. So it at most can send 100. Right? So this is actually the side channel, right? So basically what we need to do is we can have a guess and then check, right? It's actually a pretty reliable channel. Now let's look at a case where we failed to guess the correct port number. Well, in this case, the server would not be sending any challenge jack to the client. And therefore, subsequently, when the attacker sends 100 reset, it'll be able to see 100 responses. Right? So the fact that the attacker sees either 99 or 100 basically is an indication of whether the attacker has made a correct guess of the 4 tuple. Now, obviously, the attacker doesn't have to guess one port number at a time, right? Because otherwise, it's going to be super slow. The good news is, because we have a 1 second window, you can actually send multiple packets, right? You can make multiple guesses, and the attack can therefore be much faster, right? So this is what I'm going to show. So obviously, it depends on how much bandwidth you have, and so on and so forth. But in reality, we've tried to experiment with this attack. If you can send up to 5,000 packets per second, you can actually do the attack pretty fast. Now, I mentioned how you might be able to guess the 4 tuple of the connection. It's actually the same thing for sequence number and ACK number guess. Basically, if you send a spoofed reset packet with the in-window sequence number, then the challenge jack would be triggered. Otherwise, it would not. So again, we have the same exact side channel, where when the challenge jack is triggered on the server, it reduces the challenge jack count. And therefore, the attacker would see 99 instead of 100 responses when it sends the non-spoofed packets. And the same thing for ACK number, right? Once you guess the correct sequence number, you do the same trick to get the ACK number. Now, so basically we can do all these under roughly 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes. Assuming you can do this, you can send 5,000 packets per second, which I think translates to about 1 megabit per second, which is not bad at all. Now, we've done a whole bunch of optimizations to improve the reliability, the speed, and so on of this attack. And one of the things we did is the binary style search, right? For example, if we want to infer a certain target, let's say a port number, we can try a large range in the beginning, and if there is a hit, we don't know which one of these port we guessed is correct. So therefore, we can just narrow it down in the second round and further reduce it. Right? So it's basically, you can do it as a binary search. Now, our attack, I guess I'm going to skip a little bit of these details, but basically, we're assuming that the client and server IP addresses are given, and the port number on the server is also given. So the only thing we need to infer is the client port number. Right? And there's also a time synchronization challenge because the server has a clock and it resets every second this challenge jack count. So how do we know the clock on the server? Well, there's actually a strategy that you can employ it and probe and synchronize perfectly with the server's clock. But I'm going to skip the details for now. And there are some more details, basically saying that, okay, when you're guessing, let's say, sequence number, you have to gradually narrow down to the range, and then we can do binary search. But all those are kind of details, which I'm going to skip. So what's really important is to show how effective this attack is. We've done some more experiments. Besides the binary search, we can actually do multi-bin search, which is even faster than a binary. As you can see, there's a time synchronization phase, which is like a one-time cost that you have to pay for every server you want to target. And for port number inference, with our best strategy, the multi-bin search, it takes about 15 seconds. So really, all I need is 15 seconds so I can know whether you're visiting a particular website. And sequence number and ACK number inference are going to take a little longer. But basically, we can finish around 1 minute or 2. Like I said, obviously this is dependent on the bandwidth that we have. With roughly 5,000 packets per second, you can already see that the attack is pretty fast. Now, we've put this into action. We've actually demonstrated that if you have a client and a server, I guess, in different regions, in this case, the client is in California, and the server is basically spread all over the world, and we have an attacker which is trying to reset the connection between the client and server. And in this case, we see that the time and success rate, right, which is pretty reasonable. And the same thing, we even did it for Tor. We're able to shut down Tor connections arbitrarily, as long as we know the source and destination IP address. Right? And it's still pretty reasonable, even though the connection is pretty far away. Now, we also wanted to evaluate something else, right? If the connection is encrypted, obviously we're not able to inject data or payload. But if it's not, then we can do something even more fun. Now, in this case, we've actually targeted USA Today, which is a news website that periodically queries the backend server to see if there's any latest news. So what happens is that every 30 seconds, that's the interval that USA Today website has chosen, it'll send a request and get an update response. So what we do is, we'll do all these sequence number, the sequence number, ACK number inference, and then after that, what we do is we intentionally send a spoofed packet, pretending we're the client, and we send a request to the server preemptively. This actually would desynchronize the client and server. The reason is the server would send a response back because it sees the request has a legitimate sequence number and ACK number. But the issue is when the client sees the response, it'll think, okay, why are you sending me a response? I haven't even sent you anything. So the packet would just be dropped. Now, in the future, if the client sends a request to the server, it actually would be ignored by the server. Why is that? Well, because the server would say, okay, you've already sent me a request earlier with the sequence number that I expect. So now why are you sending an old sequence number, or why are you sending a request with an old sequence number? So it's dropped again. Now effectively, we have now desynchronized the client and server. Okay? So now what do we do? Well, now it's actually pretty easy. We just keep sending spoofed responses every second and wait until the next time when the client sends a request, right? Because as soon as it sends a request, we will be able to pretend that we're sending a response from the server. Right? It'll be accepted 100% without any uncertainty. Now, we've demonstrated this in, I guess, last year's GeekPwn, which basically showed this interesting login window and says that if you're interested in winning iPad or iPhone, please enter your login credential. Right? So we've shown that it's pretty reliable. The sequence number and ACK number inference is almost 90% accuracy. And the phishing window injection may not be that good because of some additional problems, which is not really related to the side channel attack. But on average, it takes about a little over a minute, right? Pretty reasonable. So here's the live, or a video demo of what we did. Basically, we have a split screen. On the left, we have the attacker screen, and then on the right, we have the victim screen. So in the beginning, we'll do some synchronization, the time synchronization. It'll take a couple seconds. And in the meanwhile, the victim would be browsing the website as if nothing is happening. I'm pretty sure the victim is very likely to spend more than a minute on the website, right? Especially USA Today. pretty interesting news website. So the attacker now is basically performing all these sequence number, ACK number inference in the background, knowing only the client IP address and the server's IP address, nothing else. And again, this is not man in the middle. So the attacker sees no traffic between the client and server. So it'll take a little while. By the way, interestingly, after we've published this attack, USA Today actually has switched to HTTPS. So I think we've done something good for them. So as you see, the attack basically, attack screen has something updating every 1 second. That's exactly because of the 1 second window of the rate limit. So now we've injected this response. We keep injecting the fake response. And as soon as the client sends a request, it'll basically be, I guess, pawned. So obviously we don't have to show you this image. Instead, we can show whatever phishing or malicious screen we want. But this is just a demonstration. All right? So that's pretty fun. Now, you might wonder, okay, this sounds pretty serious, but is it actually easy to fix? Well, in this particular case, yes. The side channel is actually not something fundamental, like we just demonstrated in our previous demo. That one was actually pretty difficult because it's a Wi-Fi feature and it's been there forever and it's really hard to change. Whereas in this case, it is a kernel problem. Right? Kernel has this global rate limit shared by all connections. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we can imagine is, why don't we just add some randomization, or some random noise to this rate limit? So instead of having 100 challenge acts allowed every second, why don't we just allow, let's say, maybe 150 in this second, and the next second maybe 89, or so just keep randomizing so that the attack would be much more difficult. So that might work, and it's exactly what Linux has adopted. And it's worth mentioning that, by the way, when we initially reported this vulnerability to Linux, Linus himself actually replied within, I think, a day, and he came up with a patch himself, which unfortunately was still flawed. And then we have to work with him to correct it. And this is the first version that actually worked, right? I think it's secure enough. And the second version is, well, why don't we just get rid of this global rate limit? Because we can actually enforce this limit on a per connection basis. Right? Why do we have to have a global rate limit? It seems unnecessary. And that's exactly what Linux does in the subsequent patch. Now, finally, without updating the kernel, you might just change the challenge ACK limit to an extremely large value, which effectively disables this challenge ACK mechanism, or rate limit mechanism. That can serve as a temporary patch, and many of many servers, many websites actually deployed this defense. So we actually have done a follow-up study after this. We published another paper where we scanned the whole internet and try to figure out, okay, which of these websites are vulnerable. And it turns out that around 30% of the internet were vulnerable at the time when we did our scan, which is right after we published the paper. And that number keeps dropping, and I think until almost a year later, it is still around 15%. So you can see how difficult it is to patch the Linux kernel, especially when they're production servers. So anyway, we've finally at least contributed back to the community and helped them fix a problem. And our conclusion is that we've discovered this pretty interesting vulnerability that affects pretty much all Linux at the time, or most of Linux at the time. And we've demonstrated this attack that can be done completely blindly, off path, in only taking about a minute. And our defenses are actually adopted, and we've done a whole bunch of measurement afterwards. If you're interested, feel free to take a look at our follow-up paper as well. So with that, I guess I'm all done.